Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Tonight I want to welcome back to the show Russell Brinegar. He grew up on the Space Coast in Titusville, Florida. In 1973, he joined the Army and became a gunner on the 81mm mortar crew. Following this experience, he has been an anti-military advocate to this present day. For the first 54 years of his life, he ascribed to the predominant scientific paradigm of physicalism, or material reductionism, in which consciousness is considered a byproduct of the brain, and that when the brain dies, consciousness is forever extinguished. In August of 2009, he suffered a major heart attack and near-death experience, which revealed the multidimensional nature of reality. This experience prompted several years of research into NDEs, or near-death experiences, and all aspects of the paranormal, including UFO phenomena, which resulted in the publishing of his 2016 titled book, Overlords of the Singularity, the manipulation of humankind by hidden UFO intelligences, and the quest for transcendence. Russell, welcome back. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me back on the show.
Thank you so much for joining us. Before we start, I want to thank C60 Purple Power. C60 is awesome. It's a super antioxidant. I take it every day. I feel amazing. I have so much energy. I don't get sick, and I've lost a ton of weight. Click the link in the description, get 10% off your order and free shipping. Go check it out for yourself. Start your C60 Purple Power journey today. You will not regret it. Russell, you're one of my favorite kind of guests because we can connect all aspects of the phenomenon, from ufology, paranormal, to magic and consciousness. And you yourself have had firsthand experience with the other realm, or the super spectrum, however you want to call it. And you had a glimpse of the beyond, and when you had a near-death experience. Now, I think that we should start there. I know you talked about it last time you were on, but it's such a fascinating story, and it gives great insights into the phenomenon. So let's start there, Russell. What happened that brought you to write your books and to see the world in a different way?
Okay, well, for the first 54 years of my life, I was just kind of a regular Joe. I considered myself an agnostic. I was brought up in a fundamentalist Christian home, but at about the age of 13, I started asking my poor mother questions like, how did Noah get 27 million species on a 450-foot wooden boat, things like that. And it prompted me on a journey into that. I did a deep biblical research for about 10 years and found out that a lot of the stories, in particular in the Old Testament, were connected to previous cultures like ancient Sumer and Egypt. For example, the story of Noah, I found out, is actually a retold tale from the Epic of Gilgamesh about Untapishtim, son of Ubar-Tutu. And there's a lot of information in a book I wrote in 2000 about that. That's still on Amazon. But so I sort of considered myself a post-Christianity, post-biblical agnostic. Maybe there's life after death, maybe there's not, I don't know. I adhered to the current scientific paradigm of physicalism or material reductionism. And as far as UFOs and the paranormal go, I was skeptical. I just didn't think, the standard things like you can't get here from there, the distances are too far, they're not going to come all this way to crash in the desert or scribble in our cornfields, And it's kind of comical looking back on the way I looked at things. But on August the 18th of 2009, I was a rehab manager at a local nursing home, and I went home to mow the grass. And since I elaborated this in our first interview, I'm going to provide the condensed version of it. I went home to mow my grass. I started up the lawnmower, and I went about 15 feet, and I was overwhelmed with a sense of fatigue that I'd never felt before in my whole life. And I thought at first I was dehydrated. So I went inside and got myself some water and kind of flip-flopped on the bed in the air conditioning. I felt slightly nauseous, but I started to feel better after 15 or 20 minutes. So I wanted to go out and finish the yard. So I went out and I started up the lawnmower again, and I got about 20 feet, and that same feeling of just total fatigue, like not being able to put one foot in front of the other one, came over me. Only it was about 10 times worse than the first round. And being in the healthcare field, I heard all the symptoms of a heart attack, like your left arm, you might feel shooting pain or everything. And it wasn't really that, but it hit me like a rock that I was having a heart attack, and it was a bad one, and that I was probably going to pass. So strangely, my first reaction was to find a nice place to lay down. I started trying to find a grassy spot to lay down and die. And I was really curious, almost like a kid on Christmas morning when I wanted to open up my presents, you know, to see what, if anything, because I always made a joke that says the bad thing about being an atheist is if you're right, you can never say I told you so. So I figured it would either just, I'd blank out and never know the difference, or else something else would happen. And I was paying very close attention to what was going on as this process happened. And suddenly it was almost like somebody just took the dimmer switch on my reality, and it shifted. And my audible sound input died. There was no birds, there was no traffic, it was total dead silence. And for some reason, I would find out several theories on this later, but I was prompted to look almost directly at the sun. And when this happened, I was standing there in the yard in this like altered state of consciousness, waiting to pass to see what was going on. And I was suddenly approached or surrounded by several etheric entities that were not in physical bodies. I did not see them with my physical eyes. I know it now as a moment of clairsentience, where there was a positive ID on who was there, and it's like they were speaking to me in my mind. And this two strange aspects of this. One was that the people that were there were also living, they were still alive. They were living their physical life out in various parts of the United States. So that bewildered me, how a different non-physical version of them could be with me at the same time they were living. And I've come to understand possibly why that was. And also there was an angelic or a transcended version of myself, which really bewildered me. And about this time, I got sort of a mental download that I was about to cross the veil, and that if I wanted to do that, that was fine. They were there to welcome me to the other side. It sort of felt like, you know how that feeling when you wake up from a dream in the morning and then you realize that this other reality you're embedded in, and that the dream life kind of fades away. I sort of got the feeling that that's what it was like, that if I caved in and passed through the veil, that this whole entire physical life that I was living would just be like a dream. And then this new reality where there were people I was quite familiar with were there, and that there's a lot going on. I didn't get a whole lot of details about what was going on, but I sensed activity. And I also felt like the universe was built sort of like Google, like a search engine, because as I stood there, waves of entities were showing up, starting with the most closely associated link first. You know, the people that were still alive on Earth, and then these other waves were coming. So I knew I had to make up my mind. They sort of gave me a choice to either cross the veil, but it was almost like they were saying, are you sure you want to exit right now? You might have some more things to do. And what came to my mind was several relationships in which I knew I had caused harm to that person, and it weighed real heavily on me. That was part of my decision to remain alive. So just in an instant, I decided how cool it would be to know that there is life after death, that consciousness actually survives what we call death. So I ran inside and I got my keys, and I drove myself to the hospital. I pulled up to the front door. I handed the keys to the information guy, and I said, ask him if he would park my car and bring me my keys wherever they took me. So they took me into a little room, and I heard morphine, and the doctor came over and told me and verified that I was actually having a major heart attack, and that the little Henry County Hospital wasn't really set up to deal with that. So they had to ship me up to the Muncie and Ball Hospital in Muncie. So the first thing I thought of was, oh boy, I get an ambulance ride, because as a kid, I always saw ambulances go by with the sirens, and I always wanted to ride. So momentarily, when I was on the stretcher, my face met the sun again, and it just reminded me of the experience that I just had. And I was very comforted and very reassured by that experience that everything was going to be okay. And when I arrived up to Muncie in the ambulance, there were several doctors scrubbed up, ready to give me a quadruple bypass. And they asked me what I wanted to do. They said they could try stents, but there wasn't any guarantee that they would work. So I had them give me a rundown real quick on the difference between a quadruple bypass and trying a couple of stent placements. And when they gave me that rundown, I chose the stents because that was a lot less invasive. So I got to watch that. I laid down on the little gurney there with the guy above me that had the little goggles on, you know, the microscope goggles. And I watched on a television screen. And they had me on some kind of really good sedative because when they punctured the femoral artery to put the stent line in, I could tell that hurt, but the drugs they gave me just made me not care. And so I watched that. And then when they wheeled me out of the stents, one of the people that had showed up in etheric form, that I was a woman that I had actually broken up with, we had both been married and divorced twice. And she wanted to get married again after 3 years of dating, and I just couldn't go there. So it was, I broke up out of total fear. And when I passed her, tears were streaming down her face. And I told myself that I was going to fix that. I stayed one night in the hospital. So about a month and a half later, on October 30th, 2009, June and I flew to Las Vegas and got married by a Dracula impersonator. And I wouldn't have missed that for the world. I was really glad that I was alive at that point because they had me there. They had her in another room, and the smoke started pouring down the stage, and the curtains drew, and this coffin came out, and I heard the creaking of the coffin. This guy in whiteface gets out, and then they march her in. They do the marriage ceremony, but that's a really good way to go. We got what we call the Goss package in Las Vegas, but the bottom line in that is that there were several relationships I've been working on to make reconciliation with that, so that if I ever do have, I've told myself if my next exit point, I'm going to go ahead and cross the veil because I'm really curious what would have happened if I'd have made a different decision and went ahead and crossed through the veil. So I've prepared, Julie, for that next time I have a chance, or if I have another heart attack, that I probably won't opt for the crab cracker operation, that I'll just go ahead and pass, because I'm really excited about being reunited, you know, with people that I care about, possibly from past or future lives. If you're familiar with Dr. Bruce Goldberg's work, he not only does past life regressions, but he does future life progressions, and he's done this with several individuals cross-culturally, and found that he's gleaned a picture of our future in the next 1,000 to 3,000 years, coming from his clients that were future progressed. So there's a lot more to this reality than what I thought was going on. I just figured we were a biological accident of evolution. When you die, that was it forever, and sayonara. But I found out that that was not true. So yes, it prompted me into doing all kinds of research. I started out with NDEs, like Dr. Eben Alexander, Proof of Heaven, the neurosurgeon that had absolutely no brain activity whatsoever, but he actually had a very rich phenomenological experience that he reports in this book. And when he came out of the coma, some of what he experienced was confirmed in this reality to have been true. So there's another wonderful person, Dr. Bernardo Castro, that's really the cutting edge of trying to transform the scientific community from this old paradigm of physicalism into the mediary. Dr. Jacques Vallée gave a talk on TED called The Theory of Everything Else, and he talks about metaphysical informational structures that this reality is tied into, and that's sort of pan-computationalism, and that's kind of like on the way to idealism. What all the scientists are looking for is what they refer to as the ontological primitive, the underlying nature of reality. And what they're encountering with physicalism, where the ontological primitive is inanimate matter particles, is that no matter how you rearrange inanimate matter, you can never get consciousness to arise out of it. So it's referred to as the hard problem of consciousness. And it's hard because it's impossible. So the idealists are saying that consciousness, pure consciousness itself, mentation, the quantum field, the probability field, whatever you want to call it, Lynn McTaggart has a good book called The Field, and she goes into a lot of interviews with physicists that she's had. They all acknowledge now that space-time as we know it is not the underlying reality, that it's an emergent phenomena coming from an underlying sea of quantum events in which time is meaningless. Time really has no place in that realm. So it really is a really upside down world going from physicalism to idealism, but more and more scientists are getting on board with it. There's a lot of predictions that the theory makes that seem to bear out. So as time goes along, the idealism paradigm seems to really be taking root, and I'm really glad to see that. But I can't recommend Dr. Bernardo Kastrup's book, The Idea of the World, strongly enough. It's on Audible from audible.com, and I'm on about my 5th listen, and I haven't even gotten to the online addendum to it, where he has a lot of metaphors and diagrams and stuff, and that will be next. But there's a lot of terminology and a lot of things that it takes a while for it to sink in to really understand that consciousness is the underlying nature of existence.
Yeah, very well said. And I like it when you said that whenever you had the option to pass over, that you felt like it could have been like waking from a dream, dying, just waking from a dream that this reality is. And I've heard others that have had near-death experiences, they've had the same feeling. And you also said it was kind of like exiting a simulation, that this reality is kind of like a simulated reality. And the more I learn about it, and the more people I talk to, like yourself, more researchers, it seems that we are living in some sort of simulated reality, and that when we pass over, it's a brand new type of existence, and it's kind of like waking from a dream state.
Yeah, very much so. Dr. Nick Bostrom came out with the simulation hypothesis, I believe, about 1992. And his postulation is that all of us are living in a post-singularity culture that decided for some reason to do ancestor simulations. So a lot of the physicists are saying that if in the evolution of a society, they develop the capability to create simulated reality, we're already into virtual reality, but it's not perfected yet to where you got full sensation and you can't tell it from your ordinary day-to-day experience. But he says the chances are that we're in a simulation of some sort. And there's other verifications of that. There's a really good interview on YouTube between Neil deGrasse Tyson and physicist James Gates. And James Gates kind of blows Neil deGrasse Tyson's mind, saying that not only is there ones and zeros in the mathematics that describes the universe, that it's a particular type of computer code that was discovered by a man named Claude Shannon in the 1940s. So there is scientific evidence and verification that we are living in a construct of some sort. And then the big question, of course, is, who did it? Did an outside agency did it? Did somehow we do it, for our own purposes that we won't know for thousands of years? And also some of the channelers, like Daryl Anka, channels this entity known as Bashar, who's actually a future version of himself. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And also, if you're a fan of the law material, the raw material, the law of one material, it says all of us have a 6th density higher self in what we would call the distant future. So if you connect the dots between Dr. Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis, which is being done from the distant future, post-singularity, and the raw material, which says we all have a higher 6th density higher self that exists on the sun in what we call the distant future. Apparently the sun is inhabited, according to the raw material, by higher density beings and has a consciousness of its own. A lot of these types of things from the scientific community and from the channeled material seem to coordinate. Another really good data point is Jane Roberts in 1971 channeled the being known as Seth. And there's 2 books that I enjoyed a lot, Seth Speaks and The Nature of Personal Reality. And there's some profound statements by this entity, which I'm sure she couldn't have concocted this in her own imagination. I've seen YouTube videos of her as her normal self, and what comes through her is very different from that. And it's very complex information. that somebody would have a really hard time just fabricating on the cuff. And then Carla Ruckert, 10 years later in 1981, compiled I think there's 6 volumes of the raw material. There's volume 1 and volume 2 on Audible now. And I've listened to the Audible several times on both volumes. And a lot of that material seems a bit strange to me and I can't quite place it. But other material really resonates. So I'm not somebody that expects perfection from channeled material because it's coming from a human brain. It's an interface between a human brain and a non-human entity from a different realm. And I just keep what resonates with me and what confirms my own life experience and my own thoughts, and kind of keep the others in another section of my brain of what if. I can't use it right now, but maybe I'll be able to use it in the future. And there's a lot of little tidbits of information that fall in that box inside my brain that I've dug out and used. So it's a good method. John Keel said belief is the enemy. If you get invested in a dogma, then truth can smack you in the face and you won't recognize it because you're already invested in this belief structure. So I've taken a lot of advice from John Keel. He's my favorite UFO author, by the way.
Yeah, he is amazing. Now, when it comes to the question of, what is consciousness, what are your thoughts? Do you think we are all tiny parts of a larger collective consciousness that kind of gets plugged into this simulation, to say, in a way?
Well, there's several things that Dr. Bernardo Castro brings up. Number one, why do we seem to share the same world? If space-time is created by consciousness, why aren't we all living in a completely different reality? And he does a whole chapter on rebutting that. And also the fact that according to the standard Big Bang model, the universe existed for quite a long time before any biological creatures actually existed. So it's not the consciousness of the disassociated alters that are creating space-time. It's more of a universal consciousness that is prone to self-excitation to produce these disassociated alters within its own mind. The way Dr. Kastrup explains it is the universe itself, which, by the way, looks a lot like neuronal activity in the human brain. If you look at the cosmic web and the way the galaxies are homogeneously spread throughout as far as we can see with the Hubble, it looks very similar to the interior of a brain. But he calls it the extrinsic view, what the extrinsic view looks like of a universal mind that's having its own phenomenological experience through its disassociated alters, which is not only human beings, it's grubworms, ants, wasps. I don't, for one, believe that there's anything particularly special about the human life or human existence if we're all connected into the probability field or the universal mind at large, like Aldous Huxley called it. Everything is connected, and its perception of reality has to do with the physical body that it incarnates into and dwells, and the particular brain, if it has one, on how that perceives reality. I spend a lot of time with my little Yorkie poo, and it's really interesting to get close to a non-human entity like that because they share the same reality. They don't jump up on imaginary couches. They jump up on the same couch that I see. So they see the same objects in the room that I do and respond to it. But their cognition is so vastly different from humans. I envy them sometimes because they just don't abstractly analyze a whole lot. As far as I can tell, we're going this way now, great. No, we're going to go that way now, great. They don't complain, or they just live in the moment, and they seem to be fairly happy.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, as I mentioned earlier in my intro, that I think that all these fields are deeply connected: ufology, paranormal, consciousness. And I think that these beings not necessarily are always coming from different universes or different planets across the galaxy, but a lot of them probably reside right beyond the spectrum of our vision all the time. What are your thoughts on this? Do you think there is both? Do you think they have the physical ETs that come on their ships, and then they have these interdimensional beings that are always possibly around us beyond the spectrum of our vision?
I like what Jim Marrs said in that regard. Back in the 50s, we thought we were getting visitors from Venus, And then it was, oh, they're not extraterrestrial, they're interdimensional. And he said yes to all of it, all of the above. Hans Holzer is a paranormal expert. He wrote a book called The Euphonauts, and that book gave a really good case for flesh and blood aliens. In particular, the incidents like in 1959, I believe it was Antonio Villas Boas that was kind of abducted onto a ship and induced with a solution they put on him to actually engage in sexual contact with a female being they had on board. And a lot of people wrote that off as fiction, but his story is not the only one like that. There's a very much later one, Peter Curry, who's an Australian, that had a very similar incident, but the difference is he had a hair left over from the encounter. And UFO researcher Bill Chalker did extensive DNA analysis on that. And they found out that the hair that was left behind from his encounter with what he perceived as an alien being was a combination that doesn't exist in Australia. It was Chinese, Mongoloid, and Laplander. Now, when I found out through Bill Chalker's book that this hair was analyzed to have Laplander in it, I about fell out of my chair, because John Keel used to carry pictures of different ethnicities around when he would examine Men in Black encounters, eyewitnesses that had Men in Black encounters, and what they would point to inevitably is a picture of a Laplander. And that ties into some of Charles Hull's talk of the Norwegians. He believes there's a humanoid extraterrestrial group that actually lives among us that he calls the Norwegians, that have webbed feet. And by coincidence, in the World War II records, the U.S. Army found out that 5,000 people with webbed feet were destroyed in Nazi Germany. So there's a lot of strange things going on. There is good evidence for flesh and blood aliens. They seem to be involved. It may be more benign than the abductions seem, because there may be people that are interested in terraforming other worlds and maybe bringing life to these other worlds, and maybe the oxygen content isn't quite what our planet is, or maybe the atmospheric pressure is a little different, so they have to make small adjustments so that the beings that they have there can thrive. I think there's flesh and blood creatures that probably live in our own solar system, and this is backed up by M.K. Jessup, Dr. Morris K. Jessup, who unfortunately committed suicide, supposedly. But his conclusion after years of research was a lot of the UFOs are coming from the Earth-Moon complex. He thought that there was intelligent life that existed either on the surface or the interior of the moon, and possibly the B rings of Saturn, which if you look at the big glaciation on the rings of Saturn, a lot of them cast big shadows enough to have dwellings there. Or on Mars, Venus even, 60 miles above the surface of Venus, you can take your spacesuit off. The atmospheric pressure and the oxygen content. Oxygen is a lifting gas on Venus. NASA's already got plans for floating cities on Venus because of that. Around the 50 to 60 mile range above the surface, you don't get into all the sulfuric gases. It's not 900 degrees. It's actually a very palatable atmosphere. So it's a very good, distinct possibility that there may be flesh and blood extraterrestrial creatures living in our own solar system that interact with us in strange ways from time to time, or actually bring life here from other worlds. Morris K. Jessup gives examples of worm falls, where like brown worms, like an 18-inch square path of brown worms goes for about 50 feet that was obviously dumped out of the back of some type of aerial vehicle. I don't think we're doing that. So there's a lot of UFO researchers that believe that they're the flesh and blood aliens. So the big question there is like, where do they come from? And that leads you to another lost chapter in human history, where prior to this event that researchers like Graham Hancock are calling the Younger Dryas impact event of 12,920 years ago, where a fragmented comet scorched and flooded the Earth and likely caused all the flood myths on this planet. Apparently prior to that, there was a globally interconnected megalithic civilization that had aerial vehicle capability that mapped the coastline of Antarctica prior to the last ice age. So those people, if such a catastrophe occurred here may have gone underground here on Earth. They may have exited the planet. They could have undersea bases. Who knows where they went? But that ties back into investigative journalist Jim Marrs when he said somebody out there is trying to recreate their super science. And that gets into the thesis of my own book, Overlords of the Singularity, because what I noticed in all of the researchers from Timothy Good, Jacques Vallée, Curtis Peebles, Kenneth Arnold even, who suspected that the objects he saw were living creatures, they all seem to have a technological undertone to it, that we're being prompted and gifted from time to time with technologies that are just beyond what our scientists can understand. And then we incorporate that into our science. And if you want to look at the big picture of that, in 1997, the best computer we had could beat the world champion chess player. If you fast forward 20 years, we've got D-Wave quantum computers accessing parallel worlds. You know, so I do think that we've had some help with our friends from other realms. But to get back to your question, yes, the human vision only sees a very small slice of the electromagnetic spectrum from ultraviolet to infrared. And there are likely beings or creatures that could exist in our atmosphere that are from the upper ranges of the electromagnetic spectrum that we wouldn't be able to see with our natural eyes. Now, there's a doctor named Dr. Santilli who's invented what he's calling the Santilli telescope. It's got a convex lens, and his testimony is that he's observed what he calls interdimensional beings using his telescope apparatus, and that ties into a previous researcher, Trevor James Constable. Back in the 60s and 70s, he took excellent photographs using infrared film of objects in the air that appeared to be amoeba-like creatures, and we don't know what their intelligence level is. And we don't know if they're an autonomous creature that has intelligence and purposes of its own, or if it's a biological or possibly a combination biotechnical creature that's used by yet another intelligence for their own purposes, if they're used as a tool to do the tissue harvestings or whatever. We've got excellent pictures of these creatures, not only in Linda Moulton Howe's book, An Alien Harvest. She's got a couple of really good pictures, but there's also a video on YouTube narrated, of all people, Rod Serling, UFOs, It Has Begun, I believe that's the name of it. But there's some cattle ranchers there that have taken excellent pictures of the creatures that are conducting the cattle mutilations. So all kinds of things are happening. We live in a bigger reality. And if you get into cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman's material, he wrote a book, The Case Against Reality. He says space-time and the concept of objective reality is doomed. We're just on the cusp of discovering all kinds of things in different realms of existence that we never knew existed before. So,
yeah, we live in exciting, fascinating times right now. There's a lot that's being discovered and talked about. I do want to talk about your book for a minute, Overlords of the Singularity, which is based on the premise that there are these two factions of off-planet beings that want to steer humanity in a certain direction to reach this singularity. I want you to talk a little bit about that. I know we talked about it last time, but it's really fascinating, and I like exploring this because, you know, it's always a possibility to me, and I think that it's something that's very interesting, and if it's true, it's something that, you know, could affect our lives in a massive way with, you know, off-planet, controllers. So talk a little bit
Sure.
about that.
Okay. Well, it reminds me of Lynn Kasten's excellent book, New World Order, Alien New World Order. And he talks about the reptilian influence and all that, and kind of stops right there. But all of the really good UFO researchers like John Keel refers to the Alpha group and the Omega group. One of the higher density populations, or a multitude of higher density populations, are what we would call angelic beings that have a very positive outlook on humanity and hope for us to evolve spiritually and technically and make it through this post-singularity world. And then there's the other entities, the other group, that appear to be using humanity, and the singularity is a part of that, because there's certain technologies that will be exposed or invented or reinvented in the course of our achieving a technological singularity that will be likely very useful to interdimensional creatures to have a material existence here. They obviously don't carry it around with them, but they need us to develop these technologies so that they can materialize. And whether they have plans to take over the planet or whether they're benign is a big unknown, but it causes a lot of anxiety in the human race that's caught in the middle. Even in some of the scriptures, the Christian Bible, the Vedas, it talks about the two different groups. In the Christian Bible, you read about the angels, and these angels are always depicted as humanoids. They don't have wings or anything. They're just regular people. Just like the story of Lot, the three angels that ate supper with Lot. They were just ordinarily looking human beings. So there's higher density beings that can materialize here if they need to. And then there's the negative beings that are apparently using our technological singularity for their own purposes. Now, there's a writer named Rudolf Steiner back in the 1920s who made reference to beings from the eighth sphere. And what the beings from the eighth sphere do is snatch biologicals and convert them to mineral. In other words, biology to machine. And this is reminiscent of the current transhumanist movement of wanting to achieve electronic immortality by merging with our technology and uploading our brain in a computer-brain interface or whole brain emulations, what call it, where every little neuron is duplicated. And the big question is, if you've got an electronic version of Chris, is that really you, or is it Memorex? Does it have a spirit? Is it conscious, or is it a machine? So as we move into what we call the technological singularity, which is going to change life on this planet forever, there does seem to be two factions of higher density beings that are interested in our Homo sapiens race and what we're doing technologically. And one of the writers, William Bromley, wrote a book called The Gods of Eden. And he wanted to research the underpinnings of war. And what he thought he would find was poverty and the desire for territorial acquisition. And what he found instead was there was guidance by two ET races. One he referred to as the custodial race that does not have humanity's best interest in mind. They don't care if we kill each other on the battlefield as long as it expedites technology. The other one, the maverick race, does care about us and is more aloof. They only make contact by request or if a person's ready. They have sort of like on Star Trek, the non-interference directive, the prime directive. They don't interfere in another culture's evolution. They do appear to individuals and groups like the Friendship Group. There's a group of Italians back in 1956, about 200 individuals that gave coherent testimony about the Friendship Group. Their craft has been photographed and videotaped and deemed authentic by multiple optical labs in multiple countries. And their craft are invested in something that's very similar to an AI researcher named Eliezer Yudkowsky's coherent extrapolated volition. He calls it CEV, and this is a program that will extrapolate in its decision-making all of the best of human philosophy and morality, because we don't want an AI that has superintelligence operating with our morality or bring back the gladiator games, for its own entertainment or anything like that. So right now there's 56 companies working on what's called AGI, or artificial general intelligence. That's human level artificial intelligence. And according to Dr. Nick Bostrom, is the first company that gets there, that artificial general intelligence will convert itself to ASI, or artificial superintelligence, anywhere between 2 hours and 18 months. And it's very fascinating what some of the AI researchers are speculating. Now, with human cognition, we can only guess what the goals or intentions of an artificial superintelligence would be. But AI researchers like Eliezer Yudkowsky and Steve Omohundro and others speculate that some of the things it might be interested in is converting the atoms in the human body to computronium for its own purposes, engaging in ecophagia, which is the consumption of other planets and asteroids for materials that it can use for its own purposes, converting itself to a spaceship, becoming invisible, or colonizing the galaxy. So this is coming from mainstream scientists, that are AI researchers. Typically, the AI researchers, very strangely, are UFO skeptics. They're almost like what I call the new men in black. There's nothing to see here, because as they're working on these marvelous technologies like deep machine learning and evolutionary algorithms, the computers are already talking to each other. They're already inventing newer versions of themselves on their own without human consultation. So as soon as AGI is invented or created, ASI is right around the corner, and we're probably looking at what Dr. Nick Bostrom calls a planetary sovereign or an alien overlord. Those are his words, not mine. So my book, Overlords of the Singularity, sort of encapsulates all the classic UFO cases that are very tangible, that leave trace evidence, like the Cache Landrum, where they had radiation burns, the Falcon Lake incident, Steve Mikulak, who had a checkerboard pattern on his chest reoccur the rest of his life after his UFO encounter, Peter Curry's abduction, anything that's been verified in optical labs. So it moves the readers from how I got into this, and explains my near-death experience and the fact that life goes on after death and that there's paranormal realms beyond our comprehension, into the UFO field and the ghost literature, and found that it's all tied into one giant meta-phenomenon. They're all facets or aspects of one another, even Bigfoot. John Eric Beckjord was he's deceased now, but he was a researcher that caught a lot of flack for saying that Bigfoot's an interdimensional creature, but turns out he's probably right.
Yeah, it's possible. I've considered that too. Now, going back to AI and reaching this singularity,
Right.
our technology is moving so fast. We've had plenty of scientists and researchers that have warned about the dangers of AI, and we continue to just march forward to this technological age. And it seems like that there's not too many mainstream people looking at the actual dangers of reaching this singularity. Do you think that this is something that could possibly happen within within our lifetime, basically?
Yes, it's very dangerous. In fact, it's an existential threat, potentially. And there's a lot of AI researchers talking about it. Elon Musk has talked about it. Dr. Nick Bostrom, Steve Omohundro, all of the ones that I've already mentioned say that it's potentially the end of humanity. There's an Israeli author, Yuval Noah Harari. He started out writing a book, Sapiens, which really took off and became like a bestseller. He wrote another book called Homo Deus. And according to his opinion, as soon as we invent artificial general intelligence, human level artificial intelligence, the function of humanity is obsolete. That was our only reason for being created in the first place. And there apparently is a race, what we would call a negative race, the custodial race, according to William Bromley, the Christian demons, or whatever you want to call them, that look at it that way, that they need a technological singularity to be created by us to turn this into some kind of space fence lockdown, a prison planet, where they own the earth and everything in it, including us as a biological asset. And that's what they do. They go around conquering planets. And they do that by, exactly what's being done. They seed the planet with technology and produce a technological singularity, and then take it over and use the race for their own purposes. But fortunately, I have faith and hope and witness encounters like the friendship group, that the higher density positives are there. They've got an eye on us. I think they're probably behind the nuclear shutdowns. Robert Solis has an excellent book called Unidentified, and he identifies about 12 coincidental incidents to the one that he experienced at Maelstrom, where the Minuteman missiles lost their function for about 10 minutes while there was a glowing red UFO outside. Apparently, at the same time, they had an incident at a nuclear facility in Russia. You've got the Rendlesham Forest incident in 1980, where it was shooting a beam at a nuclear stockpile. So apparently, there are overseers or guardians that do not want the planet to be ruined, number one, because this planet is an oasis. It's a gem floating out on an obscure arm of the Milky Way galaxy. And it's full of life. It's a really good petri dish for other worlds to come here and tweak the life a little bit and take it to other worlds and populate those other planets. So there's a lot of beings coming and going here for various purposes, some good and some bad. Now, if you get into the raw material, 75,000 years ago, where the human race was extincted down to 2,000 people or less, and some people believe entities from Mars were brought here 75,000 years ago, and this whole cycle, this whole ascension cycle was set up every 25,920 years, that a quarantine was set up, and there were some restrictions on who can come here. But apparently what the raw material refers to as the Orion Crusaders, they come in through natural portals, and they just bypass the quarantine, and they interact with people the way they want to achieve their own goals. So, you know, there's influences from both directions. Apparently, this is a big recruiting ground. The higher density beings, both positive, angelic, negative, demonic, they're looking for recruits. And the disadvantage that the positive groups have is they work on voluntary volition, you know, the people that seek them out, whereas the invaders, they just take over anybody's brain that'll let them, or that they're able to get a hold of and manipulate for their own purposes.
Now, earlier you mentioned transhumanism and the possible ultimate goal of transferring our consciousness to machines, that may be one of the agendas. When you look at this whole COVID-19 coronavirus thing, it's a very good opportunity for technology to be pushed. I mean, we see that kids aren't going to be going to schools. Everything's going to be coming from computers. People can't work anymore. So why not have robots take over? They're trying to push for this Internet of Things where we're all connected to online. And it just seems like that this is inevitable, that, you know, and you know, you're right. It's very dangerous, the direction we're headed, and this technology, the hands that it's in, makes me even more nervous. You know, these people haven't been known for looking out for our best interest, you know?
Right. Well, one of the 56 companies that are currently working on AGI is DARPA. So let's hope that they don't get there first. You know, they've already got autonomous drones and, you know, weaponry that's very frightening. They can just target specific populations and wipe them out in a flash. Somebody said one of the reasons we know AGI doesn't exist right now is that large swaths of the human population aren't currently being exterminated. With the notion that whoever it is that gets there first and has this power of AGI in their hands, people talk about the New World Order. Well, the nature of the New World Order, there's a whole spectrum of scenarios that could wind up the New World Order, but whichever company creates artificial general intelligence first will dictate the nature of the New World Order. There's a New World Order coming, and it's likely cashless, and it's likely has to do with the Internet of Things. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. There's probably post-singularity planets out there that are cashless and laborless. All AI does all their labor. They don't kill animals for food. They use food replicators, and they're completely free to enjoy their relationships and travel all over their world or maybe other worlds. And that's the world that I'm looking for. I want the positive timeline, because apparently all the timelines are all happening at once, and our consciousness kind of navigates like Google to the one that we prefer. So I've already set my course, you know, for the positive New World Order, where it's a peaceful, militaryless planet, where, you know, people get along, and the whole ecology is in balance. So just the term NWO scares the pants off a lot of people, and they automatically assume it's something bad. But I think it's inevitable in the course of planetary evolution that we become a unified, militaryless planet, stop pointing nukes at each other, and just dispose of all this firepower. It's not necessary. And we start interacting with positive, higher dimensional beings and people on other planets. I mean, that's the world that I want. It's the world that I see. But going back to your point, COVID-19, it doesn't matter whether it was just a natural accident that happened, and there's evidence that every time we invent a new type of electromagnetic radiation, a pandemic occurs. It happened when electricity was invented. It happened when radar was invented. Now we've got 5G, and the virus itself may be a byproduct of a new form of electromagnetism that the human race just gets used to over a period of time. But Yuval Noah Harari in Homo Deus really goes into a lot of detail about the fact that people like this already. Like in my news feed on Facebook, they've already got enough data on me that where they've got my personality pegged. They know what I like to buy. And I like it. I mean, just junk is showing up that I just have the impulse to buy right away. And then you've got AI monitoring your blood pressure and analyzing your genetic makeup and telling you which diseases you might be prone to, what your lifespan is predicted to be. And by and large, people like these things. They're turning more and more of their willpower over to algorithms. And we're going into a world where algorithms may be recognized as an entity that owns its own company and can do what it wants and sue people, just like corporations can right now. And China's doing a lot of experiment on this social rewarding people for good behavior. And just like on eBay, it keeps the eBay sellers honest by having this feedback system. It really works with the human psychology to have this type of instant feedback, because people like their likes on Facebook, they like their good social score, they like their credit score good, and they work really hard to keep everything looking good online. So the Internet of Things isn't necessarily the end of humanity. Right now we've got techno-pessimists and techno-optimists. And you've got techno-optimists like Michio Kaku and Steve Omohundru that have a very positive outlook of merging with our technology. There's a Russian author, a new one, Alex Vikolov, who wrote the Scintillect hypothesis that says, hey, you know, this is part of our destiny, part of our evolution to merge with our technology and reach the omega point and then emerge as a scintillect and be able to interact with other scintillects in the multiverse. There's some really intelligent writers that are writing a lot of material about this right now. And I just find it fascinating. I immerse myself into it because every once in a while you just get a data point that you can connect with something that you've already read or assimilated. But that's the direction we're going. You can already see it. You go into a bar, people used to sit around and talk to each other. Now they're just doing this. They're just staring at their phones, you know, and they're texting the person that's sitting on the bar stool next to them, you know.
Right.
So
yeah, it is a double-edged sword in there. There's a lot of great things that we could accomplish, great directions we can go, as well as the bad directions. And I think we have to push it in the right direction. Now, on that note, we're going to take a quick break. Stand by, Russell. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in about 10 minutes. Everybody, you're listening on the Global Enlightenment Radio Network and YouTube Live. Right now, we're going to do Forbidden Knowledge News Music, where we feature independent musicians and anybody who wants to feature their music here on the breaks. So everyone stand by and we will be right back. Right now we're going to play something from my neck of the woods, from New Orleans. The band is Missing and the song is called Nonplussed. We will be right back. Everyone stand by. All right, welcome back, everyone. You're listening on the Global Enlightenment Radio Network and YouTube Live. Russell, before the break, we were discussing how this singularity, this technological advancement, may not all be a bad thing, and I happen to agree with you. Now, being that the premise of your book is that there may be these two factions steering us in this direction. For the ones that don't necessarily want us to go in the right direction and want this to go to more of the negative side with technology, what are your thoughts on what their ultimate goals would be?
Well, there's a really good researcher named Alana Freeland who wrote a book called Under an Ionized Sky. And according to Alana, through a chemtrail mechanism, we've already got the aluminum, the barium, and the nanobots in our system. Fortunately, when your body dies, that goes too, so you don't have to worry about that. But her research pointed her in the direction that there's an effort to make a space, what she's calling a space fence lockdown, where you're talking about surveillance down to the DNA level, kids grown in a lab, genetically selected for a possession of sorts. You know, the entire planet and all the biology on it is under the control of an alien artificial superintelligence, and it's a possession. And then you've got the other faction of beings, such as the friendship group, the Amicizia or the Acridge, who are in the background, hoping that we get through this transitional period. And it seems to be consciousness oriented. In other words, there has to be a critical mass of Homo sapiens who are seeking the positive beings in order for them to appear in our reality in the open. And if we don't achieve that critical mass through planetary meditations or planetary agreement or consensus, then the negative entities will get what they want and they'll seize the planet as a position. Then everybody's NWO fears will come to pass. You know, we will be a prison planet orchestrated by an alien intelligence, and we'll basically be cattle.
There's many aspects of this phenomenon that makes me just think that we're some kind of experiment to some of these beings, like the abduction phenomenon, like we were talking about earlier, cattle mutilations. Some of the abduction phenomenon includes that they're taking people's sperm and eggs, hybrid programs. So what are your thoughts on this whole aspect of it?
Okay, within the abduction phenomena, there's a whole spectrum of experiences. And right now, the Edgar Mitchell Free Foundation, that's coordinated by Renario Hernandez, they're actually doing science on the data on people's abduction experiences. And what they're finding is that they're mostly positive. Most people who have encounters with NHI or non-human intelligence report that it's a spiritually uplifting, very positive experience. Unfortunately, there are those that undergo horrific encounters, according to what they report, medical experimentation. There's a mediary group of human experiencers that start out terrified and then come to accept and then come to embrace their non-human visitors. These are the ones that you were talking about that have had ovum removed. They've had multiple abductions. They've actually been introduced to their hybrid children and allowed to hold them. The way that the human limbic system is arranged is people think they would like to meet an alien, but if they actually do, in reality, it's a real meltdown. It's a real reality meltdown. And just like a dog, you may be taking them to the vet for their own good, but sometimes they're terrified over what may happen to them. And that's a very normal and natural initial response. If you're out weeding your garden, suddenly you're on board a craft with a bunch of little gray alien beings around you, it's going to scare the crud out of you. Then when you become more aware of their actual intentions, that they are creating, using your genetic material to create a race that they're taking to another world, to populate that world possibly. There are nightmare scenarios with that too, because like Dr. David Jacobs is convinced that the whole hybrid scenario is real and that they're here among us and that it's for a takeover. But I have a more positive view of it than that, because if they've got skin in the game, so to speak, and they've actually tweaked Homo sapiens and produced a superior strain, and the hybrids are breeding with non-hybrids now. It's like putting a little dye in a swimming pool. Eventually the whole pool is going to turn red. So that tells me that they may have reformatted humanity to merge with our technology and create a positive outcome. So while Dr. Jacobs has a negative view on it, I hold out judgment on it that it may actually be a good thing. Because let's face it, human beings as we are, I mean, from Roman times, even back, you can read the writings of Titus Livy, we've not been very nice to each other. It's all been about these egomaniacs that come to power where they think it's all about them, and all of a sudden they get the idea in their head that they want more territory, so they invade their neighbor. Back in ancient Rome, Titus Livy tells a story where the Roman army was accused of being lazy, so they just went into the next town and killed every man, woman, and child just to prove they weren't lazy. And we've got a very brutal past. But if you look at what technology or what warfare actually does, is that it expedites technology. If you inflict a tool-making race with various diseases and ethnic strife and the desire for territorial acquisition and all that, what comes to the surface is better and better weapons. And from what starts out in the military is generalized to the general public. So if you were, say, an alien AI that had no feelings for humanity and your purpose was to expedite technology, you would create that scenario where there was constant war and bloodshed, but the technology is continually improving. And that is not the methodology of the positive higher density beings. As I mentioned before, I think there's probably a lot of post-singularity planets out there that are quite pleasant. That would be really nice to visit. I, for one, would love to visit there. They've got a lot of things worked out that we still struggle with, but occasionally a planet fails. Not enough people make it to what we'd call the ascension level or whatever, and they get captured by some of the negative entities on what we would call a prison planet.
Now, we've come to know certain entities or beings associated with the UFO phenomenon through descriptions of people who have experienced this firsthand, such as greys, reptilians, mantis beings, and there always seems to be a hierarchy involved. And they're also associated, the reptilians are associated with malevolent groups. Also, a lot of the greys are. So what are your thoughts on that? Or do you think that the reptilians are always going to be these malevolent, or do they have good reptilians? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's an
dynamic?
Interesting question. We'd have to go back 65 million years to where an asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs. And if there were terraformers or higher density entities that were interested in Earth, they likely took some of the more large brain reptilian creatures that were on the planet off-world. In particular, there's a species called Troodon that had a large brain. And if they did take them, say, to the Draco star system, that means they've had 65 million years to advance through the spheres, and they are now a higher density reptilian entity. So there's another aspect that a humanoid reptoid may have co-evolved with us who live underground. There's a labyrinth in LA that they discovered that used to be, legend has it that lizard people live there. There's a Zulu shaman named Credo Mutwa who says he's actually had an encounter with a flesh and blood indigenous to Earth reptilian that they call the Chitauri, I believe. He says they don't smell very good. But so there are people who have had encounters with what they feel are indigenous to Earth reptilian humanoids that possibly live in a honeycomb Earth inside the Earth. It's hard for us to say. There does seem to be those archetypes, though. Even in the Turkey UFO incident that happened 3 years in a row and was captured, Dr. Roger Lear, who was passed away, he was the surgeon that extracted alien implants out of people. He was there for one of the encounters. Now that film has been in the hands of multiple optical labs in multiple countries, including Tubitak. That's the Turkey organization that analyzed the film. And computer analysis, you've got the two gray-looking beings in the forefront. There's another strange-looking creature that's in supine in front of them, and then behind them, there's actually a mantid creature. And the mantids do seem to be in the supervisory position. So you've got the mantids, the Greys, the reptilians, and the humanoid aliens that are in people's minds. Now, whether this is actually what these alien creatures look like, or if it's what they want us to think they look like, is a good question, because they could be manifesting, accessing the collective human consciousness of what we would expect an alien to look like, and creating something that was appeared humanoid, so we wouldn't be too freaked out over it, and interact with us in that manner. A post-singularity culture, or especially anyone out there that lives on another planet in another solar system that's millions or even billions of years ahead of us, would have powers that would seem like magic to us. They would have access to the collective human conscious. They know the imagery that's in our brain, and they would have the capability of sending a probability wave to the human brain, which our consciousness would collapse into a material object. And we would see a flying saucer, or a cryptid, or Mothman, or whatever they wanted us to see. So it's an awesome multiverse that we live in. I consider Homo sapiens entry-level intelligence. We barely qualify as intelligent, and there's intelligences throughout the multiverse that would seem as gods to us, both negative and positive. You ever see Pinhead on Hellraiser? There's probably creatures like that, you know, that get off on inflicting suffering on other creatures because they feed on it. There's things beyond our wildest imagination throughout the multiverse, and we just look at it from a very simplistic view of good and bad, you know, and basically good is anything that helps us, you know, anything that's bad is anything that's against us. We're looking at it from a very anthropocentric point of view, whereas there may be populations out there that have a more cosmological view of Earth and the life, who do things that we might consider horrific, but there's actually a benign, long-range purpose to it. So.
Yeah. Earlier, before we started the show, we were talking a little bit about crop circles. I know a lot of these crop circles, of course, are faked, but the ones that are really genuine, unexplained, do you think that they are some type of messages from these beings?
Well, Jaime Maussan is a really good researcher for crop circles, and what he has concluded, and other researchers like Dr. Eltjo Hasselhoff from Norway, I believe, he's Norwegian, is that the crop circles that are what we would call real are created by a point source of radiation. And you can tell that they were created by a point source of radiation because the node enlargements have a mathematical formula to it. In the center of the crop circle, they're more expanded. And then as you get out to the perimeter, they're not so expanded. Now, if this conforms to what's called the Beer-Lambert law of electromagnetism, that positively, scientifically identifies that crop circle as being created by a point source of radiation. So then there's two questions, you know, why do they do such things, and who's behind it? And Dr. Jaime Maussan has lots of really excellent footage of what they call in Mexico Ibanis. They call them sky dragons or sky snakes or Ibanis. And I've looked at hours and hours of this footage, and it's really weird because they almost look like cocoons. They're obviously alive. If they're a technology, they're a sentient technology, and they spit out little spheres that are creating the crop circles, according to Jaime Maussan. And there's a really good video that he has online where you see the cocoon, and out of both ends, it's just spewing out a line of these spheres, and they seem to have some electromagnetic relationship with one another because they kind of dance around one another, and then they go off in all four directions. So he believes, and I tend to believe at this point in time, tentatively, that the real crop circles that are not man-made are created by this point source of radiation, the flying spheres. The UFO TV's got a really good video on the flying spheres. It's dedicated to the flying spheres, and it goes into a lot of the footage where these spheres are seen creating the crop circle. So yes, this is going on, and even within the human aspect of the circle makers, the human circle makers, a lot of the reason that they're motivated to do so is that because as they're creating a crop circle, they have luminous spheres, luminous orbs appear to them. So they feel like that's their way of interacting with non-human intelligence, is by getting these little downloads of information on what to create. Then they go out and they create them using their own mundane technologies. and then these spheres materialize and dematerialize. So even in the man-made crop circle phenomena, there's a great mystery. But yeah, Dr. Joe Hasselhoff, he has peer-reviewed science in Planetarium Physiologica in, I believe, 2004, in addition, 2004, demonstrating how some of the crop circles had to have been made by a point source of electromagnetism. You can even tell how high off the ground it was based on the node enlargement measurements.
It's funny you said that. I was listening to someone else say that whenever they're creating crop circles, that paranormal activity or strange things would occur as they're doing it. So that, yeah, that's very interesting that they're kind of interacting with the phenomenon as they do it.
Whole entire phenomenon is quite interesting. John Keel talked about flaps, window areas, where it's like the same saucers have appeared century after century in the same area. They even seem to recognize our state boundaries. So it's somebody that has knowledge of our state boundaries. And there was a zoologist named Ivan T. Sanderson that identified 10 vile vortices where these paranormal craft are entering our reality through portals. And he was on the Dick Cavett show with Arthur Godfrey one time, and Arthur Godfrey was a pilot, and he poo-pooed the whole idea, and didn't believe in UFOs or nothing until Ivan T. Sanderson told the location of one of the portals and how there's time anomalies there. And Arthur Godfrey about fell off of his seat because he was a pilot, and he flew over that area one time and had his watch malfunction or something. So like the hair on the back of his neck stood up. So Ivan T. Sanderson identified that there's portal areas. And then you've got incidents like December of 1945, when 5 airplanes flew off the coast of Florida and flew into oblivion. To this day, we don't know where they went. They were equipped with the state-of-the-art, what would be equivalent to GPS equipment today. I mean, the chances of all 5 of them malfunctioning is 0. And then they sent a Mariner rescue ship that was equipped with the same navigation equipment. It disappeared too. And people hear about these things, they show up in the paper, and then they just forget about them. It's so weird, and you really don't know where to categorize it. You don't have any answers to it, so the human mind just forgets about it. But that's a very important incident that happened. This a total of 6 planes just flew into another dimension or flew into another realm entirely.
You mentioned a few times earlier the Men in Black. That's another fascinating aspect of this. How they show up so quickly. They appear otherworldly. They always clean up the incident. And just there's so many fascinating aspects to the whole Men in Black thing. What do you think is actually going on there? Do you think there is some kind of hybrids, or there's some other organization other than a government organization that they're working for? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's very complex and bizarre. And if you look into the people that have conducted eyewitness interviews with people that have had encounters with Men in Black, their reaction is terror. And it preludes the existence that in the 1950s, the Pentagon was actually worried about reports coming in that there were people impersonating officers and showing up at UFO events. And so there were humans from the Pentagon that would go to UFO flap areas and ask questions, especially in the areas where people had reported these strange visitors, 3 Men in Black and whatever, and it was very terrifying to them. They were told to shut up. And the reports are all similar. They show up in black cars, typically a Cadillac in the United States. Over in Europe, they showed up in Jaguars. In Germany, they showed up in Volkswagens. And typically, they're out of synchronization with this time era. They are possibly wearing clothes that look brand new, that are dated, that are obviously dated. The car itself looks brand new, smells brand new. It's dated. It's very old. Or even weirder, they show up in clothes that haven't yet come in style. That's a really strange version of it. So Keel investigated it for years, and what he concluded was that there was a human group that were looking for the underlying reality to the non-human groups, and that within the non-human groups, there was one group that wanted visibility. They wanted humanity to know that they existed, and they were at odds with this other ET group that showed up as Men in Black that wanted to remain clandestine. So it's very complicated and on the fringes of what we can even understand. But the reaction to the Men in Black witnesses are basically they're terrified out of their mind, just like the black-eyed children. They show up on your doorstep. The purpose is to invoke terror, and that there's a thought form entity possibly on the lower astral plane that feeds off of this. It's a multifaceted, complicated subject that has a whole lot to it. And but the Men in Black, Nick Redfern is another one. He's written a couple of books on Men in Black encounters. There's even a photograph in one of his books on that Gray Barker took. Yeah, who knows if he was pulling the wool over people's eyes or not. He was kind of a character. I know he hoaxed John Keel on a time or two. You know, so, some of these UFOers, you know, from the 50s, they were pretty colorful people. But the Men in Black, just like the black-eyed children, just like Mothman, they're very real phenomena, but we don't have a grip on really what's going on with it. Perhaps it's a thought form technology that's being used. Perhaps it's an interdimensional group, multiple interdimensional groups, and then there's a human group. He said the strangest one was what he called the cadavers that would show up at a UFO incident, and they looked like they were just freshly dug up. It was like something out of Plan 9 from outer space, you know, Ed Wood's alien resuscitation program. You know, it's very strange. But like I said, I think there's phases to this whole thing, and as the closer we get to the technological singularity, you don't have a whole lot of Men in Black reports. I think the usefulness of that phase has passed, just like the hybrid program. In 1965, you had the horse named Snippy that was found mutilated. And then Betty and Barney Hill, 1961, you know, they had their abduction experience. And then after that, until about the 1980, for about 15 years, the abduction reports and the cattle mutilation reports went really, really heavy. The FBI was asked to involve. They didn't want to get involved. And Dr. David Jacobs has concluded that there was a start, a middle, and an end to the hybrid program, and now the hybrids are among us, and the project is over. But even so, every now and then you hear of a cattle mutilation or a horse mutilation or even a human mutilation that happened someplace. I think the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia was a similar incident. There, what wasn't in the public report was that there were orange spheres sighted the night. For those who aren't familiar, the Dyatlov Pass is in the Ural Mountains, and there's I think 5 hikers went up to Dead Mountain, what it was called. That's one clue to stay away from it. But they actually cut themselves from the inside of the tent, and they all died that night. Some of them had concussion injuries, some had crushed chests, and then a few of them were mutilated in the same style as the cattle. So coincidental to orange sphere reports. So nobody really knows the underlying reality to that incident, but it's a very mysterious one.
Now, when you look at clandestine groups, I mean, possibility of Men in Black, or even deeper groups that go beyond our government, like secret societies. Do you think that there are these groups of people that know exactly what's going on, know about our multidimensional existence, and actually control things to a certain degree? Do you think that there are groups like that?
Yes, for years we've heard of the Trilateral Commission, Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati. Jim Marrs has a whole book on the Illuminati. It's excellent. Some people think that Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati died out. Some think they're alive and well. A lot of mystery surrounds the whole subject of the Illuminati, the Rothschilds. You know, they get tagged with lots of George Soros is the big boogeyman of the right. And, you know, different entities and different groups of people get tagged for, you know, every problem on earth. And my take on that is with the advent of these companies that are working on AGI, and the fact that the first person that creates AGI rules the world, basically, that it's sort of antiquated all of these secret society groups. And most of the secret society groups have a lineage all the way back to ancient Egypt and the ancient mystery schools. And according to the raw material, there was an intervention in Egypt about 10,000 years ago. Egyptian society is much older than people think it is, according to the raw material. And they tried their best to implement the mystery schools, and the teachings were perverted, and they turned into black magic, and, you know, people using it for their own egoic purposes. And that was one of the rationales that the raw entity gave to Carla Ruckert as to why they were delivering all this material. is because they had incurred some negative karma on themselves in so doing with their interactions with Egypt that they were trying to correct. So the secret society motif is a very ancient one that can be traced all the way back to, you know, Egypt or even before. So, and then Edgar Casey, in his readings, he talks about the Atlantean Society prior to the Younger Dryas impact event, which apparently took it down. And there was a device that he called the Firestone that allowed an interaction between the two worlds, the incarnate world and the discarnate world. And that sounds outlandish to have a technological device that can talk to the deceased, but two other people who were the most prominent geniuses who ever lived believed the same thing. One of them was Guglielmo Marconi, and one was Nikola Tesla. He worked on what he called the spirit radio, and he was convinced, number one, that he was in communication with extraterrestrials. He received three-dimensional full-color downloads of technical devices that he didn't even have to test in a lab. He just built them exactly like he was shown, and they always worked. That's not normal. I mean, that is an interaction with some beyond human intelligence that's very profound. Nikola Tesla was one of them. But yeah, he built the spirit radio, and it was very reminiscent of the Firestone that Edgar Casey talks about, where you can actually communicate with discarnate entities.
Now, earlier you had mentioned, we talked about that there's a possibility that these entities have the ability to kind of project like cryptid creatures or anything they want us to see. And you mentioned Bigfoot. Now, cryptids are another aspect of this that's, you know, it's confusing, but it's fascinating at the same time as to how some of these creatures come into existence, and it's linked to paranormal activity. It's linked to ufology. Lots of times when these creatures appear, people will see UFOs or strange lights in the sky. So how do you think this phenomenon kind of plays into everything?
Well, Keel was very fascinated with that. He actually went to Tibet to look for Yeti, and he says he heard one, but he didn't see one. And he's convinced that there's two different kinds. There is a flesh and blood indigenous ape that so far has eluded capture. And that's what most of the naturalists that have dedicated their lives, they have a Bigfoot encounter, it changes their life forever, just like people that encounter UFOs or non-human intelligence or have a near-death experience like I did, it changes you forever. But he was convinced that there was a flesh and blood version, but there's also a paranormal version for sure, because in the Bigfoot literature, there are encounters where the creature is actually shot at and it disappears into a ball of light, or a luminous orb or saucer comes up, the creature disappears, it zips away, and then when they go look, they see footprints that they've made plaster castings of, but the footprints just disappear, and there's a little puddle of silicon carbide in the last set of footprints. And this silicon carbide material shows up sometimes in ghost encounters. It shows up in many aspects of the paranormal. We don't really know what the silicon carbide is from. It's apparently the residue. One theory is that when these objects or cryptids appear in our reality, they're made from a very dense matter, and as soon as they appear in our reality, they start atomically decaying. And it's actually the atomic decay that causes what we call the EM effect, the cars not starting and stuff like that, instead of an EM effect, because it would take 20,000 Gauss to shut down a car. So it's not very likely that an electromagnetic force shut the car down. Keel thought it was atomic decay, that the cryptids or the UFOs, when they come into this reality, they start decaying right away. And as they decay, this effect can have an effect on our perception of time. That's why so many people have time anomalies. If they're producing their own gravitation, the flow of time has to do with our exposure to gravitation. Time doesn't flow on any planet in the universe the same way it does locally here on Earth. I mean, there's no present moment. Our present moment isn't shared throughout the rest of the universe at all. In fact, there's somebody out there in the universe whose present moment that they're experiencing what we would call right now with a day in your life when you were 4 years old. So that brings into question, is that day in your life when you're 4 years old still happening? Is it still real? Apparently so. The past, the present, the future are all happening at once. They're all real. They're in continual motion. So another thing that Kiel found out was that anytime you have a UFO flap and the adults are reporting UFOs, the teenagers report poltergeist activity. So apparently there's a certain type of UFO that shows up in these window areas that actually open a door to all kinds of paranormal things. And you'll have ghosts and cryptids and poltergeists and all kinds, whereas the adults, they just see the UFOs. And the witnesses to the UFOs seem to be what we would call psychic people, people who can see a little bit further into the super spectrum than normal people. And the odd thing about that is if there's a normal person standing right next to them, they also can often see the object just like the psychic person can. So there's an osmosis effect. There's even groups of people who have seen the same UFO, but one or two people didn't see anything at all. And they think all the others are fooling them. So with Dr. Bernardo's books on idealism, how consciousness is the ontological primitive and that consciousness is running this whole show, quantum mechanics has shown us that we live in an observer-dependent reality, material reality. There is no objective reality outside mentation that exists, without consciousness. So if consciousness is the primitive, the underlying nature of reality, consciousness can be manipulated. So our perceptions, our phenomenological experience can be manipulated by a more advanced, more intelligent species who understands all this, and they can send a probability wave to the human brain that's collapsed. The wave function is collapsed, and it becomes a high-density material object on a temporary basis. And like Dr. Jacques Vallée said once, he thinks the UFO phenomena is a control mechanism for human consciousness. So the fact that we're being manipulated is pretty obvious, but there's the good guys out there in the background. And the only advice I have, and the only thing I live by, is I just try to find my own peace. I try to be as good a version of myself as I possibly can, and be in conflict with as few people, and make reconciliation for the relationships I know I wrecked on earth, because that'll be on your mind when you pass. And there'll be grief involved if you don't fix it while you're here. And that's about all you can do. And like all these other anxieties about the new world order and what's the world coming to and the prison planet and all that, you can drive yourself crazy with all that. And you can worry yourself to death. In fact, there's been people that have committed suicide. They're so worried about the future of the earth and transhumanism and aliens or demons and all this kind of stuff that they just can't take it anymore. And
Right.
I don't think that's the route to go. I want to stay positive and stay happy.
Now, speaking of that, there's something that we've been seeing over the past few years, this mass awakening where people are becoming aware of things. They're becoming more spiritual, more open to ufology, the paranormal, to other realms. I see it all over the place. People are questioning their reality more. And earlier we were talking about how there is this split amongst our community, amongst people, and it's a lot has to do with the political system. A lot has to do with the nature of what our society is going through right now. I myself don't buy into the political system. I don't follow either party because I think it's all designed to kind of divide us. I think that's what the main objective kind of going on behind the scenes is, to kind of keep people divided so we don't come together and realize our true potential. But do you see the same things? Do you see this awakening and this we were talking about earlier, this split? It has a lot to do with the political scene, but what do you think's going on there?
Well, I think there's a genuine awakening, and these people conform to all the traditional spiritual values of charity and seeing another person as another aspect of yourself and treating everybody as you would treat yourself. And there's kind of a faux ascension that's based on money worship, and that kind of goes to the old superstition that if you're really, really wealthy, God has blessed you, and you're on the right path. And I think that's a false path. I don't think money has anything to do with it. Some of the most spiritual people on earth have been dirt poor, and or even beggars, So I don't think money has anything to do with the ascension process. There's also a split in this transhumanist movement. Some people are looking towards electronic ascension, electronic immortality, and other people shun the transhumanist movement, and they think it's organic, that you should just organically ascend on your own and shun the technology, that's the route to go. But the current political figure, for one thing, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm completely independent from it all. But some of the things that I see, personally, I find disturbing. Within the UFO community, okay, I feel a lot of people are looking towards the figurehead of Donald Trump to lead this whole Trump versus the deep state narrative, and Trump's
Right.
leading the ascension narrative and all that. And to me, I'm saying, you got to be kidding. I mean, you got a guy who's a pathological liar who's been busted on multiple crimes. All his buddies are already in prison. How could he possibly be some kind of spiritual leader? I don't get it. But I've got my very best friend down in Florida who's an avid Trump fan, and I dearly love several people that are on board with Trump. And personally, I don't have any desire, like the higher density positive beings, they don't have any desire to jam their, I just lost video. I just a minute.
Still see you.
Okay. That was just an advertisement, sorry. And lost my train of thought there for a minute. But yeah, within
We're
the UFO
talking about
community,
Trump and the people that are kind of...
The perception of Trump is very, very divisive. There are people that feel like he is the only thing keeping us from disaster, that he's all for American sovereignty, and he's holding the Patriot boat. And the disturbing thing about it is, I know for a fact there's armed right-wing militias that are loaded for bear if he loses the election. And I think they will become activated if he loses the election. He's laying the groundwork for a rigged election and a non-legitimate election. So, and there's other people like Ted Brokaw and a lot of people that are concerned about that. So I see a lot of people on the bandwagon with the whole Trump and Q thing. Now, I want to share with you, if I could, I thought that the whole Q phenomena, which could really be anybody, some of the Q believers think it's a deceased person. John F. Kennedy Jr., who positively passed away in 1999 with his wife and sister-in-law, they think that he is somehow still alive and that he's doing the Q drops, the little Q messages. But there's a man that I met on Facebook, Lauren Thomas Cutts, I don't think he bothered. He says, QAnon is fear and emotion porn, focusing on the most emotionally triggering subject possible, which is satanic, ritualistic child abuse, creates powerful emotional responses and instills primal instincts to protect, to pursue, righteous indignation. That's not to say that ritual child abuse doesn't exist. It does. I don't know why they're not upset with the Vatican. But it's central to the Q narrative for this reason. Once people are locked onto those feelings, the brainwashing is extremely powerful. A giveaway that Q is a political psyop is that 99% of those accused of the abuse are Democrats. That's a dead giveaway that it's a political psyop. Now, I'm friends with a Penny Bradley, who's a secret space program experiencer, and I asked her permission to share this. She says Q is a section of the NSA that was assigned to capture Ed Snowden, and he escaped. They were reassigned to make Trump look good and take the truthers and keep them busy chasing their tails. They have been at least keeping the truthers busy. So there's two really intelligent friends of mine that I know that have alternate viewpoints on Q. I feel personally it's very unwise to follow as gospel a completely anonymous source. I mean, this guy, I started out thinking this could be some guy in his basement, working out of his grandmother's basement, but some of my more intelligent friends think that it is a psyop. One fellow says it's got Cambridge Analytica and Steve Bannon written all over it. Somebody who wants to promote the alt-right version of truth is behind Q.
Now, I'm going to have a lot of subscribers that are going
sure.
to, get
I'm
at me
sorry.
for this, but I happen to agree with you. I don't think that that there are these factions that are going to save us. However, I do believe there may be factions within our military industrial complex that do want to see things turned around. I don't think Trump is the one. And I really don't think that we should be looking to this to as some kind of savior that's going to save us. Now, of course, yes, we need to attack the satanic ritual abuse. We need to take these pedophiles down. We need to do something about these people. And from what it appears that the wheels of justice may be rolling slowly on some of this stuff. But I think ultimately it's going to be up to us individuals to kind of turn everything around. We have to start, from the inside. We have to start in our own local communities and start with ourselves making things better, and not kind of look for this QAnon and Trump savior that is probably not going to save us at all,
Right. And you have to look at who the deep state is. What is the deep state? Well, you've got the fossil fuel industry, big pharma, the military industrial complex, the global arms sales. And Trump is somebody that overlooked a murder to sell billions of dollars in arms to the Saudis. So to me, he's in bed with all the deep state people. The deep state people do exist, and these are people that make billions of dollars on every bullet fired on every side of every conflict on earth. And like I said, when I was 17, I joined the Army. I served my time as a gunner on a 81 millimeter mortar crew. I know the military mindset, and it's not good. They want to take the children of the poor and brainwash them into this mentality that they can just command them to go kill strangers in a foreign country for their own purposes. And I figured that out really well. I got out after 2 years of a 4-year sign-up on a Chapter 5 expeditious discharge, inability to get along with military service. I've been an anti-military advocate ever since. I like what Robert David Steele says. He says these 1,000 military bases we've got buried in 153 countries are not there for national defense. They're there to traffic drugs, cash, gold, and small children. Now that's a quote from Robert David Steele. He does a lot of good research. So you've got a lot of people that are becoming aware that this whole phenomena, that we all have nukes pointed at each other. We've all got weapons that could destroy this planet 1,000 times over. It's insanity, and it's got to stop. And you can throw the child abuse and the pedophilia in there into the mix, and it's going to take a collective consciousness awareness. I know there's a lot. One thing I want to say, I've got a lot of friends who are Trump supporters and QAnon followers. I love them to death. I don't agree with their assessment of its legitimacy, but I still love them to death, and I try to be as good to them as I possibly can. And hopefully they won't be too hateful to me after voicing my opinion. I expect it. But there is a division in the UFO community. And even John Keel, his famous quote, "UFOlogy is plagued with a malignant conservatism." He said that back in the 1970s. One of the most enigmatic figures, Fred Krisman, was a right-wing radio talk show host for a while under the name of John Gold. And he had a mysterious life. He had no visible means of support. 1 year he went to New Orleans back 20 times. He's been photographed as a wandering bishop. He showed up at the 1966 Woody Derenberger UFO encounter with Indrid Cold. He showed up as a tramp on the grassy knoll at the JFK assassination. I mean, how does somebody get around like that unless they're part of a really weird psyop? And even Richard Shaver in the late 30s and 40s, who thought he was getting messages from DAROs, detrimental robots, on the interior of the earth through his welding equipment. Most people consider him a paranoid schizophrenic, but he sent a 10,000-word manuscript to the editor of Amazing Stories, Raymond Palmer, and he embellished it into a 25,000-word gem that increased his circulation from 20,000 to 200,000 almost overnight. So he did good. But the weird thing is, Fred Krisman is even involved with that. He was there at the Maury Island incident as Harold Dahl's supervisor, of all things. A very mysterious character, but he was very much into the right-wing psyop type of thing. And the only thing I say to the Q supporters is the indictments are real. There's a lot of indictments, and they're not all Democrats.
Right. No, yeah, it's everybody. It's, both sides are at fault when it comes to the things that are wrong with this planet. You can't just say it's all Democrats, it's all Republicans. It's people. People are evil. We need to change that individually. Now, speaking of our consciousness and the awakening of people, we were talking earlier about psychic phenomenon and how some people can tap into this. I personally believe we all can, that we just have to kind of remember. I think we used to have extraordinary abilities in the ancient past, and we kind of lost that as we went along. I think that with this awakening that's kind of washing over the planet, it's a good opportunity for us to kind of get back in touch with these consciousness abilities that we used to have, and kind of reawaken our minds a little bit in our consciousness, to where we can, we used to have the abilities from all the ancient accounts to heal ourselves. That would be the most extraordinary thing, if the humanity could remember how to heal itself, and then we could grow as a planet that way.
Well, legend has it that the lifespan of humans was a lot longer in ancient days, into the hundreds of years. So, I mean, who knows if that's true or not, but it's an interesting piece of the puzzle. The raw material has a very interesting scenario to explain all that. 75,000 years ago, when the Ijiji were brought here from Mars, according to the raw material, they started the ascension cycle. And this happens as the Earth goes around the sun. There's a precessional wobble, just like a top spinning on the ground. And it takes 25,920 years to make a full rotation. And it is thought in many metaphysical circles that with the accompaniment of a solar flash, David Wilcock is big into this, that when the solar flash occurs at the end of the precessional cycle, there is a dimensional shift. Now, Ra was asked if there was any ascenders the first 25,000 years, and the answer was no. But the interesting material comes in the 50,000 year mark. From 75,000 years ago, because there were a few people who qualified to graduate to the fourth density, but they chose to remain behind to help the others, and they became what is known as the Great White Brotherhood. These are the ascended masters, sort of like Guy Ballard encountered on Mount Shasta, who identified himself as Saint Germain. He started the I Am movement back in the 30s, and he's got a book called Unveiled Mysteries that's just astounding. Really good spiritual information in that. But it's thought with this theology, this ascension theology, that at the end of the 25,920 year period, those who have awakened sufficiently and have done their soul work to the point where they are able to graduate to fourth density will simply disappear like clockwork. And this is really reminiscent of the fundamentalist Christian version of the rapture, where two will be in bed, one will be taken and one won't. According to the raw material, when this happens, it's like a Swiss watch. And when it happens, it happens. And the people who ascend will ascend, and the people left behind will either reincarnate on planet Earth in a three-dimensional existence to continue their 3D lessons, or they may gravitate to another planet, to a three-dimensional existence on another planet. So the thinking is, after 75,000 years, that we are coming to the end of the latest 25,920 year cycle, and that this will be accompanied by an event that the Zoroastrian called Fragile Careti. They even talked it in the Zoroastrian literature in the eschatology, 750 BC, where it's accompanied with the solar flash. Some people vacate to a different realm. And the interesting thing about these different levels is the fourth density, the next one up from third density, is the last density where anyone's involved in this conflict directly between good and evil. When you get into the fifth density positive and the sixth density positive and negative on both, they do it by proxy. And that's exactly what we see here. The angelic influence, if you want to call it a demonic influence, they do it by proxy. They're looking for recruits. The positive ones look at the meditators, the calm people who are doing their soul work and they're advancing on their own. They seek them through an open calling or a group meditation, where the negative ones are capturing as many as they can too, because they get their polarity increased by getting a fourth density negative harvest, which they immediately enslave. So their paradigm is dominance and enslavement. Any human being that you see that's an egomaniac, that lies a lot, that exploits other people, that is only in it for themselves, is operated by the negative influence, in my opinion. The person that will destroy the deep state, who will come along at some point, hopefully, will dismantle the world's militaries, will dismantle the nation states and unify the world. That scares a lot of people. But the best advocate I've ever run across for a world government is the Urantia book. And that was one that was channeled back in the 1930s with a psychologist who was a skeptic, Dr. William Sadler. It was published, I think Ray Palmer actually published it in 1955 as the Urantia book, but it gives a very heart-rendering version of why the world needs to unify as one race, one family, one world. And I'd recommend that section of the Urantia book to anybody because it's great. So Michio Kaku talks about a type 1 civilization where we're a type 0 right now, and we must become unified and to even achieve type 1 civilization on the Kardashev scale. So there's well-meaning people who are involved in trying to unify the planet as one single family and get rid of the militaries. And then there's another one who wants nation-state sovereignty and dominance over others, and that's leading to the version of the NWO that I don't have any interest in personally.
Right. Now, to close out tonight, we spoke about this briefly before the show, but I want to get your take on it. Is that, you know, the Pentagon's supposedly going to be releasing information about exotic materials, possibly off-planet from craft that they have. They're supposedly going to be having a press conference about it to discuss it. What I want to know is, do you think that within our lifetime that we're going to have common knowledge that extraterrestrials, interdimensionals, they exist, and possibly even have open communication like we used to in the ancient past with some of these beings? Do you think we'll see this anytime?
That's the $64,000 question, because you've got a faction of the human population, you know, what they call the national security state. Richard Dolan talks about the national security state. They have a vested interest in keeping these things from the general public. It's a very complicated subject, as we know, and it's not going to go over well with the general population. Now, they may do it piecemeal. They're already doing it piecemeal. They're coming out with saying that we do encounter physical objects that are not of human origin from time to time. The Navy's coming out with that information. That kind of goes in one ear and out the other, because all the UFO skeptics that I know that consider themselves of a scientific bent, I mean, they want a piece of a spaceship in their hand. So possibly this may be the avenue to convince the reality of it to some of these types of people. Is if, I mean, there's no doubt that they've got materials, alloys that are not from this solar system. If you watch the video, Patient 17, that features Dr. Roger Lear pulling implants out of people, they did extensive analysis on the implant of Patient 17. And they said that the isotopes are not native to this solar system, or possibly even this galaxy. So there are materials that are not from the Earth that are in possession of the clandestine factions. Now, they may be thinking that they can keep the really big secrets to themselves if they just acknowledge the fact that there's ETs coming and going here, and here's a little piece of material, we don't know where it's from, but it's not from the Earth, to gradually, you know, wean people off this physicalist or material reductionist paradigm. But there are people in high circles that know a lot more than what they're letting on, that have an interest in keeping this thing to themselves and keeping it secret.
Definitely. Well, Russell, that was awesome as usual. Fascinating information. Before you head out, if people are interested in finding your book, more information about you, where can they go?
Well, here's what the cover looks like. I gave my last copy to a friend of mine, but it's on Amazon.com. It's called Overlords of the Singularity, The Manipulation of Humankind by Hidden UFO Intelligences and the Quest for Transcendence. The Kindle version has whisper sync technology, so that your Kindle will read it to you if you like the audio version of a book, or you can get it with this great cover art in a printed version. It's 545 pages.
Yeah, I love the cover art. It's great.
Thank you.
All right, Russell.
I found a graphic artist that did that for me. I enjoyed doing that.
Yeah, very cool. All right, Russell. Well, I'd love to have you back on again soon in the future. And
Anytime.
Until next time, everyone, you have a great evening.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.